The flight was calm, passengers dozing off as the hum of the engines filled the cabin. In row 7 sat a quiet woman, unnoticed, blending into the sea of travelers. But then the intercom crackled. The captain's voice carried an unusual urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, do we have any combat pilots on board?" Every head turned. The cabin froze. And row 7 would never look the same again. The cabin was calm, the kind of calm unique to Madeira travel, somewhere between serenity and tension. The hum of the engines acted like white noise, lulling passengers into sleep or distraction. A child clutched a stuffed bear. A businessman scrolled endlessly on his tablet. A couple whispered quietly about their vacation plans. Nothing suggested that anything extraordinary was about to happen. In row 7, seat B, sat a woman whose presence blended seamlessly into the ordinary. Dark jacket, hair tied back, a travel book resting unopened on her lap. She was quiet, polite to the flight attendants, and invisible to most who passed her by. To anyone glancing her way, she looked like just another traveler crossing time zones. Then the intercom crackled. The captain's voice filled the cabin. But unlike the usual rehearsed announcements about altitude or turbulence, this one had an edge, sharp, urgent, almost pleading. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. If there are any combat-trained pilots on board, please identify yourselves immediately." For a moment, no one breathed. The words didn't make sense. Passengers exchanged confused glances. Was this a joke? A drill? The flight attendants froze in the aisle, their professional smiles faltering. The businessman in row 9 muttered, "Did he just say combat pilots?" His voice carried the nervous laugh of someone trying to deny reality. But the captain's voice returned, firmer this time. "Repeat, if there are any combat pilots on board, please make yourselves known to the crew." The air seemed heavier. Questions spread through the cabin like sparks on dry grass. What was happening in the cockpit? Why would a captain, thousands of feet above the earth, ask for combat pilots? In row 7, the woman shifted in her seat. She kept her eyes forward, her breathing steady. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was racing. She had heard that tone before, the urgency of commanders under fire, the unmistakable call when lives were at stake. Her hand twitched against the armrest. To stand up would mean unveiling a past she had left behind. To remain seated meant betraying everything she had ever trained for. A flight attendant moved briskly through the aisle, repeating the request, her voice trembling slightly. "If anyone has piloting or military flight experience, please let us know." All eyes darted around the cabin. Rows of passengers stared at each other, waiting for anyone to rise. And then, slowly, the woman in row 7 reached for her seatbelt buckle. The metallic click rang louder in the silence than it should have. A hush swept over the rows as she stood, steady and deliberate. Every head turned. She looked unassuming, but the way she carried herself, straight-backed, controlled, eyes sharp, sent a ripple of recognition through the crew. The quiet woman was no longer invisible. Row 7 had just become the center of the story. The aisle seemed longer than it should have been as she stepped forward. Every eye followed her, whispers darting between passengers like sparks in dry brush. The flight attendant met her halfway, relief flashing across her face. "Ma'am, do you have piloting experience?" the attendant asked, her voice hushed but urgent. The woman gave a small, measured nod. More than experience. Her tone was calm, but there was weight in her words. The kind of weight that only comes from years lived in silence after a life defined by noise, jet engines, missile locks, and the chaos of war. As the crew guided her toward the cockpit, passengers leaned into the aisle, straining for a glimpse. The businessman in row 9 muttered, "She doesn't look like a pilot." But another voice, an older man near the window, shook his head slowly. "Trust me, I've seen that walk before." It was true. She carried herself with the unmistakable posture of someone trained to act under pressure. Shoulders squared, step steady, eyes scanning but never darting. Not the confidence of arrogance, but of survival. Inside the cockpit, the situation was grave. One of the co-pilots had collapsed unexpectedly, leaving the captain to shoulder the controls alone. They weren't in immediate danger yet, but the strain of long-haul navigation and potential emergency maneuvers was more than one set of hands could safely manage. The captain looked at her skeptically. "You've flown before?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Combat aircraft. Multi-engine. Over 100 missions." For a heartbeat, the cockpit was silent. The captain studied her, as though weighing whether this quiet stranger could be trusted with hundreds of lives. Then, with a curt nod, he motioned toward the empty co-pilot seat. "Strap in." As she settled into the chair, muscle memory returned instantly. Her hands hovered over controls she hadn't touched in years, yet everything felt familiar, like riding a bike, except the stakes were thousands of lives and a machine hurtling through the sky. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, rumors swirled like a storm. Some passengers speculated she was ex-military. Others thought she might be part of some secret government program. The child with the stuffed bear whispered to his mother, "She's a hero, isn't she?" Her past wasn't something she often spoke about. To the world, she was just another traveler, living a life far removed from the noise of war. But in reality, she had once been a decorated combat pilot, flying missions in hostile skies, facing situations where every second decided life or death. She hadn't planned to reveal that part of herself again. But life, it seemed, had other plans. As the engines roared and the horizon stretched endlessly ahead, the woman in row 7 was no longer just a passenger. She was once again what she had sworn she'd never need to be, someone who could take command when the world demanded it. And now hundreds of lives depended on her. The cockpit hummed with tension. The captain's hands gripped the controls, but the weight on his shoulders was clear. With the co-pilot unconscious and medical, suddenly, turbulence jolted the aircraft, sending trays clattering in the cabin. Gasps echoed through the rows of passengers. In the cockpit, alarms blinked angrily, warning of the storm front ahead. The captain cursed under his breath. Diverting wasn't simple. Fuel calculations were tight, and weather was closing in faster than expected. The woman's hands moved over the controls, her calm presence cutting through the chaos. "Banking 5 degrees east will thread us between the cells. It's narrow, but it'll hold." The captain hesitated. Then, with a nod, he followed her lead. The aircraft tilted smoothly, the nose angling toward her chosen path. Outside, lightning flickered across the horizon, nature's reminder that the sky belonged to no one. In the cabin, passengers clutched their armrests, some whispering prayers, others staring wide-eyed at the storm. But one flight attendant, watching the cockpit door, whispered with certainty, "She's in control." As the plane steadied, the captain exhaled. "You've done this before." Her eyes stayed on the horizon. Too many times. And in that moment, a piece of her past slipped through. She remembered missions flown in blackout skies, evading threats unseen, making decisions that meant comrades lived or didn't. She remembered how every choice was a razor's edge. And though she had buried that life, it had never really left her. Minutes stretched into an eternity, but the turbulence eased, the storm drifting behind them like a shadow left in the past. The alarms dimmed. The plane leveled. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound in the sky. In the cabin, a wave of relief washed over the passengers. The businessman who once doubted her now muttered, "I owe her a drink." The child with the stuffed bear whispered again, this time with a smile, "She's definitely a hero." Back in row 7, when she finally returned to her seat, the cabin erupted in quiet applause. She gave no speech, no explanation, just a faint nod, as if to say it had been nothing at all. But everyone on that flight knew better. The woman in row 7 had saved them, not by chance, but by the quiet strength of a past she carried in silence. And though the world may never know her name, that night, in the sky, she had been exactly who they needed.